Welcome to the Environmental Justice Lab podcast. I am your host, Dr. Leslie Joseph. Thank you so much for joining me. So we're continuing our series on sacrifice zones, and today we're going to talk about an excellent investigation into sacrifice zones that was done by ProPublica. Now, if you don't know ProPublica bills itself as an independent, nonprofit newsroom that produces investigative reporting and journalism with moral force. They say that they dig deep into important issues, shining a light on abuses of power and betrayals of public trust, and they stick with those issues as long as it takes to hold power to account. That's how they describe themselves. I'll be honest, I'm not familiar with ProPublica. I've never heard of them before. I'm not aware of their reporting. I'm sure they do those things. I just didn't know about it. But when I came across their reporting on sacrifice zones, I was very impressed. So on this episode, I just want to highlight that reporting. I want to just encourage you to check it out. It's a really helpful series that they've done that can help us understand how pervasive and how serious sacrifice zones are across the country. So we're doing that on this episode of the podcast. Stay tuned. This is the Environmental Justice Lab. Welcome to the Environmental Justice Lab. I am Dr. Joseph. Thank you so much for listening. So on this episode, we're talking about ProPublica. We're talking about their investigative reporting on sacrifice zones. And I personally think this is a really helpful, useful resource as we consider what is happening across the United States and the pervasive nature of sacrifice zones throughout the country. And so I just want to talk about a couple of things I noted on the website that was really helpful for me, and some things that I think are important for us as we think and talk about and advocate for communities that are dealing with these issues. The most important thing that they've done, I think, is this interactive sacrifice zone map. There's a link to it in the description. I would strongly encourage you to click on it, put in your zip code, put in your city or state, and see what comes up around you, because this map highlights sacrifice zones all across the United States, and it is a really critical, important piece that I think we could all benefit from. So what ProPublica did, which is really impressive, is that they've analyzed 5 years of EPA data on cancer-causing industrial air pollution. Very specific, because they've noted that these industries have to report very specific types of air pollutants to the EPA to include in their toxic air inventory. By doing that, they have this information from all across the country, but because it's the EPA, it's kind of just dumped into one place without any real context, without any real analysis of what it means for people who live in those areas. And so ProPublica has taken it upon themselves to look at that data, correlate it spatially with these communities that are dealing with the fallout from this pollution, and then determining the types of cancer risks that are involved with living in those areas. And so after looking at this data and analyzing it and mapping it and assessing the risk associated with it, they've found over 1,000 what they're calling hotspots throughout the country, places where the cancer risks from the air pollution is elevated above EPA's limits for what's acceptable. And so this reporting says that an estimated 250,000 people live in areas where they are exposed to levels of industrial air pollution that exceeds the cancer risk that the EPA finds acceptable. And so that is already a big finding. The idea that we can now go to a place and see and understand how damaging these types of industries can be to communities that are surrounding them. And of course, through the reporting, they've been able to show that these areas, these communities, are predominantly Black, predominantly Latino, predominantly low-income areas, because that's where these industrial facilities are purposefully located. The reporting bears that out, and they have a map. I'm telling you, this map is nice. So you open this map up, you type in your zip code, it sends you to that area, and it tells you how far away the closest hotspot is to that zip code. It is really impressive. And below the map, there is a list of hot spots you can click on to learn about what's in those areas, how high is the cancer risk according to the data that they have available to them and how it relates to the people who live there. And so it is really an impressive resource to utilize. And it's interesting, ProPublica is very specific in how they quantify this risk. They look at the data, they analyze it, and they provide the cancer risk that would be experienced by people who live in those areas. So in case you didn't know, I didn't know this, but the EPA's threshold of acceptable cancer risk surrounding an industrial facility is 1 in 10,000, which means that if you have 10,000 people living in a place, that there will be one additional case of cancer over the lifetime of exposure to that air pollution. So you're living in a place, 10,000 people are here, we're doing just fine, there's no problem. A facility comes into our neighborhood, starts producing whatever they produce, starts emitting air pollution, and the EPA has decided that what's acceptable is if when that industry comes, that only one of us out of the 10,000 could potentially get cancer during our lifetime. That is the acceptable risk of having that facility in our area. That's what the regulations say, but of course, we want the risk to be as low as possible. Experts will tell you, people who study the impact of this air pollution and the impact on public health will tell you that even though we have this 1 in 10,000 threshold that's acceptable, that even risks that are 1 in 100,000, which is 10 times lower, is still a problem. So they would argue that the actual risk level that the EPA has set isn't low enough. And there are still issues when you have areas where the cancer risk is 1 in 10,000. People would argue that you should have a risk that's more like 1 in a million. But either way, that's where the regulations stand. And so what ProPublica has done is they have taken that data that the EPA has collected from all these facilities, they've mapped it, and then they've calculated the risks of those facilities on the communities. Because one thing that happens when you're trying to get a permit for your facility is that the regulators typically look at your single facility and they'll decide if your operations will fall within that threshold, that 1 in 10,000. And it's probably true that your one plant, your one factory can fall within that threshold and get permitted. But what isn't considered is the cumulative effect of having multiple facilities in the same area. And so now, okay, my one facility over here gets a permit, then another one comes, they get a permit, then another one comes and they get a permit, and another one comes and they get a permit. And now I got 5, I got 10, I got 20, I got 50 facilities that all individually may be okay, but you add them together, you have a high risk of cancer and other issues that aren't accounted for because the math and the analysis isn't considering all that's happening in the community. It's only the individual singular facilities being permitted in isolation. And so that's another problem. And I love this analysis. I will say it's very well done. But you have to also remember that they're only doing cancer risk because that's what's reported to the EPA. And so there are other issues with inhaling these toxic fumes and living beside these facilities that ProPublica just wasn't able to fully quantify. And so that's one of the smaller limitations of their work and their research and their analysis. But I still think there's value in seeing how what's just publicly available can tell us about the risks of living in these areas. And so it's really important to be aware of all that's going on around us, all that's happening in these communities, and to understand that there is information and there is data and there are opportunities to learn more. And once we learn more, we can do more and we can advocate from a much stronger position with this data. Another feature of their reporting is that they have articles and instances where their reporting has actually resulted in substantive change in some of these communities. So for instance, the EPA has granted the state of Mississippi $500,000 to do air monitoring in Pascagoula, Mississippi. And this came a year after ProPublica's reporting came out. So ProPublica did this reporting in 2021. And towards the end of 2021, their reports and their map and their articles started coming out. So 2022, last year, the beginning of this year, people are starting to respond to their reporting. And one of those responses is this $500,000 grant that the EPA gave to Mississippi to do air monitoring. And that came as a direct result of the analysis done by ProPublica that showed that elevated cancer risks in this city. And so what's interesting is that the residents have been complaining for a long time, for years and years, that these fumes and this smoke is causing us health problems. They were saying things like they're getting headaches, and they were dizzy, and there's nausea and respiratory issues. And they were pointing to the oil refinery that's next door, to a shipbuilding facility that was right there, and saying these industrial activities are harming us. And they weren't able to get any traction until this data from ProPublica was put in front of people, and they started talking about what they were actually seeing and what the data was showing, and get a full picture of what was happening. And so that was one way that this reporting was useful in actually changing the way things were done. Another instance was in Verona, Missouri, where they've instituted some air monitoring as well, because there's a big manufacturing plant that produces a carcinogen called ethylene oxide. The mayor of this town has been clamoring for air monitoring for over a year. And he was saying, we had this analysis from ProPublica that shows that this facility is contributing to elevated cancer risks in our city. They were saying in some parts of the city, the cancer risk was 27 times higher than what the EPA thought was acceptable. And so now that we have this data and this understanding, the EPA has instituted some air monitoring in this city to get a better picture and to have some information to show to the facilities to say, look, you need to stop operating this way because you're harming the community, because you're exceeding the acceptable limits of what you can emit into the atmosphere. And so that was another instance where this analysis actually made a difference, a very tangible, significant difference in a very particular location. Another instance where this reporting was extremely influential was in Louisiana, where they were preparing to build this $9.4 billion petrochemical complex. It was going to be the biggest industrial project in Louisiana's history, and it was going to be placed in an area that's already known to be a hazardous area, so much so that it's called Cancer Alley. That's the name of this stretch of land where there's hundreds of facilities and plants and factories already operating, already damaging the community. And there was a proposal to build a new $9.4 billion mega complex in the same area. But in 2019, ProPublica did their analysis, and they found that in the area where they're going to build this complex, the air that was already there contained more cancer-causing pollution than 99.6% of the industrialized areas in the entire country. So just think about that for 1 second. So even before this facility gets there, the air is already contaminated to such a degree that there's more cancer-causing contamination than 99% of all the other industrial areas in the United States. And so ProPublica found that if they put this facility there, that it would cause the toxic air levels to triple in the neighborhood. And so because of that analysis, they were able to halt the construction of this facility and withdraw the air permits, because at that point, the state was able to see that this facility would not be able to adhere to the Clean Air Act and protect the residents. And so this is another example of how this investigation really made a difference. And along with that, lawmakers in Congress, because of this reporting, began to propose legislation to bring air monitoring to more places around the country. And so in February of 2022 of last year, 3 U.S. representatives proposed a bill that would require the EPA to monitor the air in communities that were overburdened with pollution. It was called the Environmental Justice Air Quality Monitoring Act of 2022. And this program would have had a $100 million annual budget for 5 years that would enable local state agencies to monitor the air quality block by block in areas that were deemed to be overburdened with pollution. Now, I'm pretty sure this bill did not get passed. I don't think it went through the process. I don't think the Senate really took it up and gave it a fair shot. And so this particular bill is not a law, but the premise and the approach and the understanding was set forth in front of all of the lawmakers. And I'm sure that subsequent environmental legislation has these types of provisions in them to help communities that are dealing with these issues. And so that is just a few of the features of this ProPublica investigation. Just think about what this has done. We have this interactive map where you can go online and search the country, search your area, search your state, see where these zones are, where these hot spots are throughout the country. It works for any zip code, any state. You can learn more and more about it just by going and looking. And we've seen different instances where using this data and using this analysis can really help your advocacy and your activism when you're trying to shut down plants that are coming to your neighborhood that's already overburdened, when you're trying to get better monitoring, better oversight over certain facilities that are already in your area, and when you're trying to push back against businesses and industries expanding their operations and trying to do more and more in your community that's already dealing with these hazardous levels of air pollution. That is what this investigative reporting can do. And so I'm not here to say that ProPublica is this great, amazing, investigative journalism nonprofit. I'm sure they're very good. My point is that having this data and having this information makes a difference. And so just to summarize and close out this episode, I just want you all to know that data matters. Data really makes a difference. The science matters. The science makes a difference. People have been complaining. They've been showing their individual stories, and they've been highlighting what they've been experiencing, and they know intuitively how harmful these areas are and how much this pollution can devastate their neighborhoods. But they weren't getting any traction, and people were looking at them as isolated incidences of cancer, of asthma, of other respiratory illnesses, and not thinking about the community. But when you bring in data and you start taking a closer look at a wider range of people, of incidences, and you use the EPA's own metrics and their own understanding of how these hazards affect people and present data alongside your stories and alongside your personal understanding of what's occurring, it's a very powerful way to make a difference. And so we need to make sure that when we advocate for change policy-wise, when we advocate for different actions to be taken by our officials, by our local, state, and federal officials, that we bring in some data and some quantitative analysis to make sure that people know that we're not just complaining. We're not just trying to argue and convince you of something. We actually have data. There's actual reporting. There's actual information that we can present that demonstrate what's being said all along, that there is a cumulative effect of having all of these facilities in one small neighborhood, one small community, that there are real public health issues that we're experiencing because of their activities, not because of our personal habits, not because of our income. We're not, as minorities or as Black or Hispanic individuals, more or less healthy or unhealthy or predisposed to certain specific types of diseases or illnesses. This environment is directly causing excessive cancer in our community, excessive asthma in our community, heart disease, cardiovascular illness. The data is showing that. That is one way that we can press and push for change, is to encourage people to collect data, encourage our local officials to monitor the air, test the water, make sure that the environment and the people who are operating within our communities are operating according to the guidelines and standards and rules and regulations that have been set forth by the EPA, by the people who are responsible for our public health and well-being. Let the data do the talking. And when you share your story, let's make sure it's supported and that it's buffered by the specific data and the information, because those two things together make a powerful statement about what's happening in our communities. I even went online yesterday just to see, are there sacrifice zones in my area? So I typed in my zip code. I looked and it said, the nearest one is 22 miles away. I scrolled up. I can click on it. I can see the cancer risk in that area is elevated. I can see how widespread that cancer risk is. I can see what industries are in that zone. And because I'm familiar with the area, I know intuitively who lives in that area. That zone is in the northeast part of Columbia, South Carolina. I know it's predominantly African American that live there. I know that a lot of low-income families live there. I know these things and I see these things, and I'm sure the people who live there have a different experience than the rest of us in terms of their health, in terms of their education, in terms of their everyday way of life. It's just different. I know that, but having this tool and have an opportunity to pull it up and see it on the screen and know that there was significant data and analysis that's gone into it helps more and more when it's time to talk about it. That's one thing I want us all to take away from this episode. Data-driven discussions and analysis can help us all advocate more strongly for a cleaner environment and for justice for the people who live in these areas that are completely overburdened by pollution, by industry, and that have been sacrificed for someone else's profits and well-being. And so let's think about that. I got links in the description of this episode. Click on them, go to that map, put your zip code in, check out the series of articles. I think they did a great job putting it all together. And let's continue to educate ourselves and continue to leverage these resources to make a difference in the world. Thank you for listening. This has been another episode of the Environmental Justice Lab, where we are for the people and for the planet. We'll see you next time.